Thanks for asking.
Glad to hear it, man. Oh, no, not at all. That's great. And it's good to see all of you. Happy Wednesday.
Nice.
What a crazy time. But we have a fantastic speaker, and Kristy, it's good to see you, and a great project to dig our teeth into. So indeed, it is a great Wednesday. Just a few quick reminders, guys. You all know this, but remember, just in case you haven't had a chance to register, we have our Osher Memorial Lecture tomorrow with Frank Lehrhoven. So remember, it's a webinar, so you have to register in advance for that. And then same thing for Friday morning, right? So that's 9 to roughly 12:30 for our Governing the Commons 30 years later. So we're really keen for that. David, where are we at? Where's the pool? Is it 1,200 registration?
We were over 1,200 when I looked, but I haven't looked today, so God knows.
Okay. Yeah, there you go.
It's
so
a
that's
hefty
exciting.
turnout.
Fantastic. Yeah, no, that's
and
exactly.
Frank's lecture was like almost 170 for tomorrow. So.
Gotcha. No, that's great.
Excellent.
So welcome everyone to the research series. Great talk, I thought, really provocative by Frank last week on the publication game. So I think it'd be fun to kind of follow up with that, frankly, in more detail. So I'll talk to Frank, and I'd love to hear your thoughts as well on other ways that we can kind of come at this topic, because I like the idea of using this series not only to highlight your work, but also to think, broadly about the research process, right? Including the hurdles that we all face and the way that the game, frankly, is rigged, as Frank was discussing, and what we can do about that. But for today, we get to kind of return to form and focus on Kristy's work in particular. So guys, you all know Kristy, I think it's fair to say. It's good to see you from the School of Public Health here at IU. And she has this great paper on regulatory institutions, immigration, and genetification, the social-ecological context shaping responses to soil-led contamination in Southeast Los Angeles that she has teed up for us. So thank you so much for joining us, Kristy, and allowing us to highlight this for you. And without further ado, over to you. And per usual, guys, remember to use the raise hand feature when the time comes to join the queue, and also use that chat box as well. Thanks so much, Kristy.
Great, thank you, Scott. Thanks everyone for joining today. I'm excited to present and talk about this project. I'm very thankful to the Ostrom Workshop in general. I was a fellow a couple of years ago, and you all helped support my research last year as an awardee, so I'm very appreciative of that support and excited to just share the work with you, despite it being in a virtual setting. I'm also excited for today's chat. I was on a Zoom call of another presenter earlier this morning, and it was so jarring to go from last night's debate to this like civil discussion when people gave people time to answer questions, and it was almost.
What are you talking about, Kristy? No, it's fake. sorry, I couldn't help it.
Exactly. So I'm excited to chat in a forum that gives everyone more than 3 seconds to respond to. Let me
it should
go
have been
ahead
done
and...
actually over Zoom. Wouldn't that have been great if they could have just muted?
Oh my gosh, it would have been so good. Yeah, that's definitely something needed in the future for that particular pair. Okay, so let me go ahead and share my screen. So again, Scott introduced the name of the paper. Its working title currently is about regulatory institutions, immigration, and gentefication, the social-ecological context shaping responses to soil-led contamination in Southeast Los Angeles. The topic of this paper really kind of started understanding and learning about some of the challenges in my own community, which is Northwest Indiana or Lake County, Indiana, where a lot of the communities are facing a very similar situation with soil-led contamination. We've seen that here in Indiana, in Muncie and Indianapolis and Northwest Indiana. So while the case is specifically focused on Southeast Los Angeles, I think it has connections both here in the Hoosier State and beyond. But I did, this topic eventually did lead me to Los Angeles for a few reasons. And I was really excited to work with collaborators in Los Angeles and my research committee, my team, to kind of frame this case study and get to, go out there a few times with the support of the Ostrom Workshop, meet people, chat with people, get tours of their homes, go to religious services, and just kind of engage with that community. So I was very fortunate in that way. And my research is very, very like value laden. I'm very like aware of that, like from an epistemological standpoint. And so I really believe that all people have the right to a safe and health promoting outdoor environment. So when I started getting exposed to this idea where my body of literature comes from, it's always that, being outside is good for you, and it's good for your mental health and your social health and physical health. And so getting exposed to some of these ideas where that might not be the case for all peoples was really important to me. Today, I'll kind of go over some background about Southeast Los Angeles and some, about my case, go over some very brief literature review, the methods, the results, the typical structure, and then I have some additional content and tables and figures in case they come up during Q&A. I wanted to just define a few terms. I'll use these throughout the presentation, and I feel like, it can turn into alphabet soup. So when I say DTSC, that is the state of California's branch of the Environmental Protection Agency, or protection agency that focuses on hazardous waste laws and regulation. And so that is a state regulatory body. The PIA stands for the Preliminary Investigation Area. It's also called the Exide PIA, Exide being the polluting factory. It's a geographic area that was determined by DTSC. It's approximately 1.7 miles in radius from the Exide facility, and I'll pull up a map in a moment. And roughly 10,000 properties are located within the PIA, and those are predominantly residential properties. PHB stands for protective health behaviors. These are those things that people engage in for the purpose of promoting their own health. It can be everything from putting on bug spray when you go on a hike to prevent tick bites or mosquito bites, to purposely eating a salad rather than an Ostrom workshop cookie, even though I always go for the cookie. I always go for the cookie. And then RSLC would be, representative soil lead concentration. That's measured in parts per million. So, it can go from 0 up to technically infinity, although you rarely see values beyond like 1,000, 10,000. And then SELA is Southeast Los Angeles. So to describe Southeast Los Angeles a little bit, it's a really beautiful community. It's kind of known as the physical homeland and spiritual health of the Mexican diaspora in the United States. This region has historically been, a melting pot of a lot of different immigrant populations, although it is predominantly Latinx now. It has a very residential character, despite having some kind of like pockets of heavy industrial activity. And after the 2016 election, actually, one of the cities, and several of them kind of joined on afterwards, was the first to declare themselves a sanctuary city after that election. So obviously it's like very tied to its immigrant population and Latino culture. But like a lot of communities, and especially a lot in urban centers, it has a really high industrial burden, to the point where a lot of community organizations will talk about how amongst policymakers, like this pursuit of profit is often put before people, which is like a kind of refrain that we hear a lot in environmental justice circles. And it's been noted as one of like a handful of the most like extreme examples of a human sacrifice zone in terms of the environmental burden. So as a region, it's really had a really high burden beyond just the soil lead, which is the focus of this talk. Numerically, the case is centered on the soil lead contamination that predominantly came from a Exide facility, so right here, in the center of Vernon, California, that had the capacity to produce the equivalent of about 11 million automobile batteries a year. So those batteries are lead acid, so that's where the lead is coming from. The city of Vernon technically only has like 112 residents as of the last census. This might go up to like, almost, this might double by the 2020 census to about 200, but it's really small. It's extremely industrial, but surrounded by all these residential communities. So when they permit different companies or infrastructure to come in, there's not a lot of kind of like teeth in the game in terms of residents who might, fight such an action. In a lot of these communities, for instance, Bell, which is on the south side of the PIA, almost half foreign-born residents, which kind of affects agency to get involved in political processes. The median home sales price in Huntington Park, for instance, which is the southwest side of the PIA, is nearly $500,000. The median house price in the whole county is about $2/3 of $1 million. So obviously some big barriers to like kind of like home ownership here. And so on that note, you know, in a lot of these communities, for instance, Maywood, which is just south of Vernon, you know, 1/3 of households experience severe housing burden, and that's spending more than half of your income on housing. Just to kind of go over at a high level some of the literature that informed this study. Obviously, kind of a core tenet of this work is in environmental justice values, where we see health burdens and other inequities generally disproportionately impact low-income communities and communities of color. There's also, kind of on the flip side of that, though, there's also this large body of literature, specifically in public health and outdoor leisure, where we see these generally like positive associations between access to green spaces, access to the outdoors, and physical and mental health outcomes. That said, so for instance, this case is focusing on soil lead. And when we think of lead, we often think about lead in the water, or like, you know, like lead-based paint chips. But decades of lead use throughout the like late 19th and 20th century have really resulted in a permanent soil lead footprint too. This is driven by is an interesting term because for a long time, gasoline was like a lead-based gasoline. So that was emitted by everyday automobiles that people owned. But then we also see concentrated burdens affiliated with like lead processing centers. And then, you know, there really is no safe blood lead level in children. The CDC has said that. They typically have a standard of like 5 micrograms per deciliter, or maybe even 10, depending on the state that you're in. But we've seen really low levels being correlated with, you know, negative health and social outcomes. So for instance, you know, even in this community with an Exide, they've done studies using like children's like baby teeth. So showing that even during like prenatal life stages and early life stages, that there's this correlation between lead in the environment and, you know, lead in people. And we've also, so on that note, we've seen this evidence between soil lead concentrations and blood lead levels at the community level. That said, in terms of really kind of understanding how people react when faced with a hazard such as soil lead contamination, there hasn't been a lot of research into these objective and subjective measures of soil lead, and or there hasn't been a relationship between objective measures of soil lead that might be known or understood and people's like subjective responses. And then, you know, in contrast to kind of more social ecological models, which, you know, we grapple with in various forms in the Ostrom workshop, a lot of health frameworks, especially in the late 20th century, started to really focus on individual predictors of behavior rather than like structural or social context. So in terms of kind of the two research inquiries, one was kind of more focused on kind of like a purely public health angle, and that was driven by the embedded unit of analysis. So when I was looking at protective health behaviors of folks, you know, it was really situated in like a value belief that individual adaptations are kind of an affront to health, are an affront to health equity, especially in an environmental justice case wherein the polluting entity is not the one who really bears the burden. And then, you know, understanding that in environmental justice context, that these social and structural inequities can really influence a lot of human life in capitalist systems. Just to briefly go over the methods. So I did an embedded multi-method case study design. So the embedded unit was the survey instrument, which had like a stratified approach to selecting participants based on a few criteria of both soil lead contamination level and presence of a child within their household. That was distributed to 400 households that had been randomly selected ahead of time across all 7 communities within the PIA. And then, you know, I framed that within kind of a larger, wider scope of the case study, which collected data based on interviews, documentation, archives, and some observations to kind of contextualize those results. And so that larger framing was within the Department of Health and Human Sciences social-ecological model of health, and then situated obviously within this critical paradigm too. So that first question was, do objective or subjective measures of soil lead contamination actually predict productive health behaviors? And so a key part of this assumption is that each household did receive, or at least it was told to me that each household did receive some sort of packet explaining the objective measure of risk. So assuming that each person understands their objective and subjective soil lead level, whether that really influences protective health behaviors. And that was primarily answered via the survey instrument. And then the second part was, given this soil lead contamination issue, how do people respond and how does it impact their daily lives? What are the institutions that might shape them? And that was primarily driven by interview data with some other supporting forms of evidence as well. I'll go over this just briefly. So in the quantitative analysis, so some of these independent variables were the representative soil lead objective level measured in parts per million. We had a few other measures of hazard perception, kind of getting to subjective perception about the in general concern about soil lead contamination in the community at the specific household property level. And then thirdly, on household health. So whether they think that this issue that they might have heard about in the news or via that mailed survey packet actually influences their household health. And then the dependent variable was the summative score of 7 health protective behaviors. So looking at that first one, I did not identify any significant relationships between those protective health behaviors and any objective or subjective measures of soil lead. So I initially looked at it based on like a continuous scale. I'm thinking that, perhaps as someone's objective soil lead contamination level increases, so too would their the subjective perception of the risk. But then I also looked at it based on some substantive levels. So for instance, a lot of the institutions have cutoff points within the protective or the soil lead level. So they say, if your household has a soil lead concentration level below 400, you don't need to be as worried. Or if it's above 1,000, that's like an industrial level of soil lead. So even looking at this outcome variable based on these kind of substantive levels that policies are based on didn't really make a difference. And then among most sociodemographic factors, I didn't identify a statistically significant difference in protective health behavior score based on things like education or gender identity or presence of a child. Although notably, there was a statistically significant difference in protective health behavior score based on language, because the survey had been distributed both in English and Spanish, and people got to choose how they responded. And so Spanish language respondents had a higher protective health behavior summative score than the English language respondents. And then, I looked at some of these variables and kind of wanted to understand the multivariate effect of them, whether you're controlling for some of these other factors. Given the sample size, which is something that I'll get to in the discussion a little bit, I only wanted to have a small number of variables in that multivariate model. But controlling for other factors, I still didn't see a significant impact on protective health behavior based on these objective or subjective measures of soil lead. But we did see still that the language of a survey was a significant predictor, as was presence of a child, which is important because, this might mean that even if parents aren't choosing to engage in more protective health behaviors because of the soil lead, they still might be engaging in protective health behaviors for other reasons, such as cleaning or washing hands before eating, which would still be protective in terms of their young child who are most vulnerable to soil lead. And then there were a few kind of factors that I thought were important to kind of contextualize these results in. One of the questions on the survey simply asked people to identify what was their objective soil lead measure at their household. And again, all of these households received allegedly from the state a packet explaining what their soil lead results were, but very few survey respondents were able to correctly identify their soil lead level when provided a list of options, which I thought was really interesting. This could very likely be due to the survey packets provided by the state were extremely long and complex, usually between 80 and 120 pages, because I got a couple redacted copies, to the point where they were like really hard to interpret. And they also tended to use inconsistent terms. So while households were told about their upper confidence limit, like UCL, that wasn't the term that the state then used to decide how to do soil cleanup. So it was really kind of muddled communication. And then I also noticed that a lot of the sampling and cleanup efforts really didn't necessarily serve the most vulnerable groups. For instance, it's been almost 5 years since the state started doing soil sampling, and they still hadn't reached a legal agreement with the local public housing agency to allow them to even come in and like dig a few inches into the soil to conduct the sampling. For some reason, it's been caught up amongst like a legal team for about 5 years. So because they haven't done sampling, that also means that they haven't done cleanup. So I am nervous that because of some of these institutional barriers, some of the most vulnerable groups aren't being served. Just some of the interview transcripts kind of illuminated some of these things. You know, one person I talked to who did some outreach amongst the community said, you know, there are people who said I have my packet, but nobody has come to explain what it actually means. A lot of people who live in the community don't understand what 400 parts per million is or 800 parts per million is. So they have this number and they don't know what to do with it. And then there's also some like general distrust of some of the institutions. You know, some people said, you never know who's knocking at your door. And then another individual kind of shared, you know, we've always been dealing with these big polluters, and every time, you know, the state just gives them a free pass. So it was almost like just this inurement to this continued, like what they perceive to be inaction. I think the rate of tenancy, or like having tenants and some of the limited housing options, has definitely shaped responses. There's a really large rental population, which drove the inaccessibility of a lot of the sampling and cleanup efforts. Technically, a resident who was a tenant and not the landowner could give permission to the state to do the sampling. And I believe to that degree, even the cleanup, but obviously a power dynamic between the homeowner who might not want the attention or anything else going on their property, even if by law the resident has the right to consent to the soil sampling. I think there's always this like kind of like overarching power dynamic of saying, you know, if I consent to this without my landlord's approval, does that mean I'll be kicked out at the end of my next lease? And then again, I think I mentioned this earlier, about 2/3 of households within these communities experience a housing burden where 30% or more of their income is spent on housing. And then, you know, 1/3 experience a severe housing burden. So again, just kind of like verbatim text, you know, a lot of residents talk about how, you know, because they're tenants, they're afraid of the owners. In California, they have the right to get it tested or consent to the testing, but people were still scared. So some people refused to kind of engage in the cleanup because of that. And then, you know, layered with this like fragile housing market is obviously folks' immigration status. And so nearly half of residents were foreign born, which can really reduce your ability to navigate some of these formal systems and specifically seek recourse when faced with some of these kind of formal institutions, because you just don't know, by consenting to, you know, a state agency coming in and sampling your soil, like what else, like where else does your name go? How are these records maintained? As a researcher, I experienced like clear anti-gentrification efforts, particularly in Boyle Heights, which is this really kind of like up and coming district within Southeast Los Angeles, and even anti-Gentefication efforts. So gentrification is this concept that even within predominantly Latino communities, when some of the youth that might have been raised in that community go and like pursue further education, come back in and start new businesses, whether it's like a hip, new, trendy coffee shop or art gallery or whatever. You know, that concept is called gentefication, and it came up a couple of times, where even being like raised within that community doesn't necessarily isn't perceived as giving you permission to dramatically change it. And I still remember, like, I was going to go on this bike ride of like a toxic tour of the community, and there, like, even within like environmental justice circles, there was this really clear like element of like, we don't want people who aren't from this community, we don't want gentrifiers or real estate developers here, which I thought was interesting. that you saw those issues overlap really clearly. So a little bit of discussion. There are obviously some limitations and delimitations. I think Tony was probably around last winter when I did an initial survey actually of 100 that wasn't ultimately included in the final 400 to just see what my sample or response rate would be, and it was 3%. Like, it was dramatically low. And that was even with, you know, a financial incentive and English and Spanish surveys. So we adjusted a few elements and ultimately got the final survey up to about 14.5%. So obviously, like, some non-participation and low response rate reduces the generalizability of this within even the case. Also had a trip out to LA canceled in March due to the novel coronavirus. So things that I had ready to do door to door just went out first class mail. And then, but I think more importantly, even when you get into any sort of like environmental justice case, the complexity of around like the time frame of a long period of time and several issues, not just one, really should inform like how communities their responses are interpreted, because, you know, soil lead is not the one and only issue in this community. And so I think that's an important limitation too. And then there's also this assumption that like widespread soil cleanup is an appropriate solution to soil lead hazards, where there's also been literature that stated that some communities, you know, rather than have their community garden ripped up and replaced with new soil, would rather like to see something different, like bioremediation or something. So again, there's a limited sample size. I did rely on a politically constructed case boundary. So there were even some discourse within the Exide PIA that the PIA lines itself, that 1.7 mile radius, didn't really represent the true impact of this polluting facility. Because of that initial low, like 3% response rate, I had dramatically cut the survey instrument to kind of make it faster to administer, especially in person, which kind of cut out some elements that I had wanted to look at. And then, you know, the case excluded residents who had not consented to soil testing, because if they didn't consent to soil testing, I wouldn't know what their objective level of soil lead was. And then it also, you know, didn't include folks who had already had their cleanup conducted. And then, you know, without going into like a lot of detail on all the kind of discussion elements, in terms of other literature, you know, in another somewhat similar case in Switzerland, they found that there wasn't a clear relationship between objective and subjective measures of soil lead. But that said, in that case, residents didn't actually know like what their objective measure was at the household level. They just had kind of this like general community perception. So I can situate these results in that to some degree. I think in terms of kind of like a cognitive dissonance, no one really wants to like realize the threat at maybe the household level. So for instance, in my results, perceptions of the soil lead risk was always higher at the community level than at the household property level, and that has been supported by others. So I think that indicators of culture too, like the Spanish language use, may be more important in determining some of these behavioral adaptations than objective or subjective measures of soil lead. And I think just kind of overall, without questioning some of the structures that result in some of these procedural forms of injustice, whether it's zoning or disenfranchisement in legal systems, I think, especially for people who focus on like behavioral adaptations from a public health perspective, without kind of contextualizing it in some like the social and economic context, you kind of really dangerously ignore some of the barriers to these communities and some of the efforts to address like structural limitations. So I think that that's really important. And so that was mostly it. And so thank you for your time so far. And I'm looking forward to kind of questions and dialogue around this.
Well, thank you so much, Christy, and right on time. Well done. Can we do a round of applause, virtually at least, for Christy? That was great. Thank you. And as we said, guys, the queue is open, so feel free to use either the raise hand function or use the chat box and to throw out a question or kind of reserve your spot that way as well. Usually the raise hand is kind of, you know, frankly, the easiest, right? So yeah, maybe just to help kind of kick us off here, I'm just kind of wondering, Christy, I'm sure the field work has been, particularly challenging to dig into right now. So I'm wondering if you could maybe say a bit more about where you see this project, heading next. Are you going to try to do a series of comparative, analyses looking to see not only at the kind of LA area, but how this same, variables are playing out in other afflicted communities, either across, the country or frankly around the world?
Yeah. I think that's a conversation I want to have, especially with one of my collaborators in Los Angeles, to see what direction they want to take it in. Because personally, I would like to kind of do some like collaborative or comparative case studies. But it's really important to me that like this case gets used in a way that this community has opportunity to use this case and this research in a way that they see fit. So I'm first prioritizing like getting this distributed within Southeast Los Angeles, partly because we're seeing different narratives in terms of like how much of the soil lead is an issue and how well the community understands the risk. I think at some point I cite in the document that something like, a year or two ago, the local county public health agency did a survey, and they found that like maybe half or 2/3 of people didn't report getting their survey sampling their soil lead sampling results. But like my research showed that it was like potentially even much higher, which is worse. So I'm hoping to get this out there as soon as possible. I do think there's an opportunity to do some comparative studies, particularly because, interestingly, when Exide Los Angeles got shut down, it was actually the only soil lead processor or battery lead acid processor west of the Rocky Mountains. And so it all got shipped to Muncie, Indiana. So a lot of the equipment that was at that facility is now here in Indiana. So, these problems never truly go away. They go somewhere, whether that's overseas or someplace that is more friendly in terms of its regulatory systems. So I would love to see whether I trace Exide itself to its new locations or just similar communities. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Absolutely. Yeah. Other questions, comments for Christy?
Yeah, actually, I have a question, if that's okay.
Well, please, Jamie. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Sorry, B.
Christy, you mentioned like a little bit about home ownership versus the lack of home ownership in SELA, and I was wondering, does your study ever parse out which respondents were homeowners and which ones were tenants? And did you see like a higher response rate, among the various groups of like living situations?
We're just taking a few notes. I honestly didn't. I think, if I could go back in time, I probably would, because I think that's a great idea. I would have liked to parse out like whether the person was a homeowner or a tenant. And, it's something that kind of emerged during the course of the research. So I think that's a question I'd ask in the future. But, I think, and then that's also part of the struggle with like those standard socio-demographic questions that you're supposed to ask at the end, like ethnic identity and racial identity and age and income. And it wasn't something I really thought to ask about, and it didn't come up. I did a series of expert panel reviews, and I had some folks from the community actually also like kind of review the survey and provide feedback, but it just wasn't something that came up. So I wish I had.
Well, those are some of the things you learn, right? The more you do these types of things. But no, that's a great question, Jamie. And Stephen, I thought that was a good question as well that you just posted in the chat. I'm wondering if you just wanted to kind of unmute and kind of expand on that at all. Otherwise, I can paraphrase for you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Stephen Mack. I have a PhD in anthropology. I'm not a public health expert, but I live in Los Angeles. So I know something about these communities. The study has compared neighborhoods such as Boyle Heights, which is part of the city of Los Angeles, with cities such as Vernon and Bell. And in the paper, it points out that Vernon is really not a residential city. It's there for businesses. So is Bell. And so I'm wondering where the public health information and communication is coming from. Is it from the County of Los Angeles, which would include all of these, or the feds, or the state, or the individual city public health agencies, if they even have one. So it seems to me that the political context would be important to consider in relationship to those communications, and whether what you found is going to be useful for changing anything. Who are you going to talk to change communications? I'm sorry, I'm an applied practicing anthropologist and always have been. I'm not an academic, and so I'm always interested in making use of any research or evaluation that I do.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it's tricky, yeah. So within the 7 communities of the PIA, there were 3 different types within them. Some were like neighborhoods of Los Angeles, so like Boyle Heights, for instance. Some were standalone municipalities like Bell and Maywood and Commerce. And then there was also parts of unincorporated county, which is like parts of East LA. The public health communication efforts I saw were, I would say, almost like 99% either from the county itself, so CAPH, like County of Los Angeles Public Health, which technically kind of like was an umbrella organization over all of them. And so when they did things like blood testing and community outreach events, it was usually the county that led it. Sometimes the state DTSC would kind of work on some of the communication efforts in terms of like, here are the things that you should be doing to protect yourself from soil lead. So sometimes they came from the state. Of the 7 communities, only one, I believe, I think Vernon technically has its own public health department, but that's really internally focused on like compliance with permitting regulations of the companies. So like they weren't really engaged in like community outreach because they really don't have a community other than like the workers that are their stakeholders. So yeah, I think like from like a boots on the ground, if I were to communicate with folks about like how effective public health outreach were, it would probably, the most relevant body would be the county, because I think that was kind of the lead in terms of organizing public health, blood lead testing amongst children. And they led some survey work where they went door to door, asking folks about the efficacy of their outreach of it and stuff. So I think that they probably have the infrastructure and the budget to handle it. But yeah, I think like the fact that like the communities are so different too. I almost like struggle like calling like the Exide PIA as one cohesive unit, because it's separated by like interstates. It's not like some other urban communities where you step over a city street and you're in a new community that's somehow like really similar to the next. I think that from Commerce to Huntington Park to Boyle Heights, like those 7 communities are just so different from each other too. Does that answer your question a bit?
Yes, thank you. I got 2 other questions. One is, did you find out that the people rarely understood those 90 to 120 page reports on lead before or after you did your analysis, your quantitative analysis? I wouldn't even have bothered. If people don't understand it, why would you expect any correlation at all? Which you found no correlation between actual lead contamination and individual behavior. So why did you do that part of the study?
I think partly because that was a narrative that I had heard, one elsewhere in the country, but also specifically in Los Angeles, where I saw the transcript. Like I was talking to someone who went to a community meeting, and they were like, well, I told them that I had, my results came back at like 450 parts per million. And they told me, well, because of that, like, you shouldn't garden, like you should do like fruiting trees, but not like do root vegetables. Like, so I think that there's this perception among some of the relevant agencies that if people know their objective level of risk, that they will somehow like act in response to it. So like there had been these communication efforts like, oh, like if your soil lead is below 80 parts per million, like you're fine. And if it's between 80 and 400 parts per million, maybe do this. But if it's above this, do something else. So I was curious like whether that pattern would actually standard. I highly suspected it wouldn't. And so I think your point is spot on. Like I really didn't think that I would see an impact, which is also part of the way we should be thinking about prevention efforts too. So if we know that even despite the most expensive hundreds of millions of dollars of cleanup efforts, that people still aren't like responding to these objective threats in these like logical linear ways, then maybe we need to be thinking about, like, instead of putting $100 million on cleanup and communication and all these other things, that we should be thinking about prevention of like not letting companies pollute air for more than a decade beyond what they were supposed to, which is just really hard.
I'm reminded of another situation in Los Angeles where Los Angeles actually sits on the largest urban oil field in the US. It was one of the things that was heavily used to build the city economically, was oil wells. There are still oil wells within the city boundaries. And there was one that was literally right across the street from a low-income housing unit. And people are now doing the equivalent of fracking. And this releases chemicals into the soil and into the air. And the neighborhood housing organization fought what was going on and actually used crowdsourcing to gather data from people on their health impacts that they were having. The people didn't know what was causing their headaches and so on and so forth. So, and they kept calling in it was more than one. They would call in the city, the county, the state, public health agencies, and it wasn't until inspectors would never find anything wrong when they arrived. And it wasn't until 3 or 4 inspectors physically got sick while they were inspecting the facility that there was any change. So, I think you're spot on in terms of this has to be approached a different way, and there has to be coordination across public health agencies too. And maybe it takes a local, which brings it back to Ostrom, the Ostrom workshop. What is the group response of the residents that you would recommend from what you've learned? What kind of organization or so on would be best here? Or do we have to depend on the already created government agencies to do something?
Yeah, I think that's a great question about who the relevant agencies are. It reminds me, I don't know if this got into this, like the manuscript I shared with Ostrom, and maybe I should share it, but I remember I was speaking with someone who does research out there, and they talked about how they went to one of like the meetings where it was like the local air quality monitoring district was there, and the public health officials were there, and DTSC was there. And they said that like typically when you go to these meetings, you see these representatives kind of on the defensive from the community, but it didn't even get to that point because it was just like almost like a shouting match between the different regulatory bodies of like people almost like sat back and just watched this. Like it was almost like last night, right? Like people are just like kind of talking over each other. And I think what I struggle with in this case is that like Vernon is such a bizarre, Vernon is a really bizarre city, right? So if they, within the bounds of the law, it has 112 residents. They're all super tied to the city in terms of like, they all have government positions or are tied to industry in some way. And so if Vernon wants to put something in the city of Vernon, which is surrounded by so many thousands of people, as long as it fits the letter of the law, allegedly, and claims that it will do its due diligence, like there's not a lot that the community can stop from letting, there's not a lot that the local area can do to stop the state from giving them a permit. So I would be curious if anyone here is familiar with models where people who aren't like representatives, it would be as if, Bloomington had only 100 people, but then the city of Bloomington were actually surrounded by 10,000 people, but like this like 100 group people have all this like power over the health of all the others. And I'm not sure what that would look like because, you know, that structure still stands today. And yeah, that's something honestly I'm just grappling with because, and part of it is like the efficacy of the regulatory agencies, because part of the problem is like, you know, they exceeded their emissions year after year and, you know, would get a slap on the wrist. And for almost 3 decades, they existed on a temporary permit because they knew that they wouldn't ever really get by on a permanent, they would never get a real permit to pass. And so all these loopholes of being on a temporary permit for 3 decades, when like, that's not the definition of temporary, it's hard to I still struggle with grappling with that. So I wish I had a better response to that one.
Oh, no, that's great, Kristy. And these are great questions, Stephen. I just want to make sure that everybody has kind of a chance to weigh in as well. So if it's okay, maybe we'll just circle back if you have any other follow-ups. So guys, the floor is open. So again, feel free to use oh, it looks like Brian, you wanted to jump in next, and then we'll go from there. I do have just kind of one other question as well, but Brian, yeah, please go ahead.
Partially it started to come up, but you said this area was known in terms of having some activists who'd worked on some of these issues. So if you could maybe say a little bit more about that, and then what plans or thoughts you're considering in terms of how you may share back your findings and, you know, beyond just, you know, government agencies.
So the first question was about like asking, just like kind of like activists involved. Is that right? Like
yeah.
kind of that.
What they've done around this issue, including what you talked about of, you know, kind of poor communication, so people get results that they find hard to understand or act on.
Yeah, it's been a slow process. There's been, historically, there's been like a variety of organizations operating in Southeast Los Angeles. In the 80s, it was like Mothers of East LA. More recently, there's been groups like Communities for Better Environment and East Yards Communities for Environmental Justice. And if I had to kind of characterize their approach, it's been, you know, that like long, hard process of being kind of like the squeaky wheel for a really long time. So it was like, you know, back in late 90s, the first report came out saying that like, oh, like this facility might have been polluting lead for a long time. And they did like a few bits of sampling and it came back, but like there wasn't a clear like kind of approach of like how to measure it in terms of impact on human health. And so there'd been kind of this like loud or like little rumbling of concern where the community would say like, we want you to come do some systematic approach to testing the soil in a larger radius. We want like to see like testing for like blood lead. And like that happened for almost 15 years until 2015, until like these groups would say, we want this systematic approach being measured. And then say there is no public health concern, there is no public health concern. Like there were these meetings where these leads were like, this is not a widespread public health concern, until finally some like little bit of evidence made a judge say, you know what, like this facility either needs to be on a real permit within the next 2 years, or it needs to be shut down. Until finally that happened. And then all of a sudden all this retroactive like testing and sampling happened to find this really big footprint. So it was like, that was really from the late 90s to 2015, when, so more than 15 years of just like kind of like keep pushing it through these systems until finally it was addressed. And then in terms of like how to share back this work, one of the authors on this paper is kind of a collaborator out there. So I've been working with her about how we might want to approach it. I think that honestly, like that process kind of got slowed down with the pandemic because, you know, things that we were hoping to present it at this fall just got canceled. And so I think I want to talk with her about like approaches to kind of share this out in a more meaningful way. And then luckily I also work with some researchers out there who are on like long-standing committees. So I've been working with them on like disseminating it within some of the committees that are like the groups that are the ones to kind of push things forward. So there's a few folks that I've been working with to kind of get this distributed, but it's been a slow road.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, Gustavo, please.
Hi, can you hear me? So maybe I did not quite understand something. So again, so take that into account to address these questions. But imagine the following situation. So it's there is an environmental potential environmental damage, if it is really only focused on this small community of 100 something residents, and essentially they are kind of, and if it's just focused there, they are just internalizing that. So maybe they don't have full information, but at least they don't have a big coordination problem. They're a very small group. Probably they are also participating in the decisions, blah, blah, so no problem. So the whole problem here is the externality, no? The environmental damages that are generating to the other areas outside of these 100 residents, no? Why this is not treated as an externality in that case? It's like, if the rights are not clearly identified, you can sue. So, or if there is a public health issue, well, you can go to a kind of higher level agency, no? But for the residents in this small community, it seems there is no issue. They already internalize everything. They have all the incentives to put the cost and benefits of doing this in their own backyard, essentially. But again, maybe I missed something. I didn't understand something.
Yeah, here, I'm gonna pull up the map too, because I just like maps in general. Oh. Yeah, so you are right. So like Vernon, it's kind of a wonky shape. It's purely industrial, and there's technically only like 100 residents of it. And even amongst those 100, I would like, if I had to guess, it's probably like they're like it's the city council and the mayor who families have lived there for over a century. So like it wields a lot of power, but like there's no like stakeholders with skin in the game, or well, those are the ones who like obviously want to maintain the status quo. But it's surrounded by thousands and thousands of properties. So yeah, it's just an externality that's been like kind of just distributed on the surrounding communities from, you know, Boyle Heights all the way down to Bell. And I guess, you know, I think that like when we think about externalities, and again, it's been a while since I've taken econ, the struggle is like, you know, the way to write them is so long and has so many opportunities for like deception, right? So like I was talking to one person who does work out in this community, and they were saying how they were curious. It wasn't Exide, but it was another facility. It was a waste management facility or something. And they said that, you know, in order, like one of the ways that we might protect against externality is to measure like emissions, right? To make sure that people aren't polluting more than they're supposed to. And this person said that they were actually like went to the facility to ask for a copy of like their self-reported emissions data, because that's what they're supposed to report to the state. And they were flipping through them, and all of a sudden they realized that they clearly had just Xeroxed the same table and changed the date on it, because all the data was like perfectly matching up to like the 10th of a decimal point, which is like impossible. And so they went to the state and was like, this can't be right, because these people are just reproducing the same data and just like putting a new date on it. And, you know, that facility, which was not Exide, but that facility just kind of got like a slap on the wrist, and it got like some sort of fine, but like nothing really like happens, right? So it's very possible that during the point of that reporting, they had been far exceeding their emissions thresholds without like any retribution really. So it's just like that sticky element of like, if there's an externality, is there a way to like control it? But in terms of the systems to do that, I think that they're pretty weak here. And then also you have the temporal element where, you know, it was decades of being on a temporary permit. It's hard to measure like a true externality. So if someone emits 5-fold the amount of lead emissions into the air that they were supposed to, like the health outcome associated with that might be decades, right? Because one of the things we know about soil lead is that even at really low levels, which might not seem that bad, it has all these societal impacts later on, whether it's like reduced academic performance or higher incarceration rates. So I just feel like, again, I'm not like that, I'm kind of grappling with this idea of externality, so I might be off the point a bit, but like, it's like, how do you actually measure its impact truly, especially over like periods of time, right?
Can I have a follow-up there?
Yeah.
So something maybe related with Stephen's point, it's like Stephen was asking more about what kind of governmental agencies could, you know, address the issue. And I was kind of following a different alternative path. It's is there enough here for a collective action lawsuit? Maybe we have lawyers here that can correct me if I am going in the wrong direction. But that's another way. It's like people outside Vernon says, well, we have enough information to, and again, it could be a pool of lawyers that start everything, and they sue and they start with collective action against whatever companies or whatever, whoever is the person or the organization generating this environmental damage.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think
lawyers, Gustavo.
The judicial system is one that came up a lot. There were a few times when I was asked, like, what needs to happen in order to like move this forward, and a few people said it has to go through a lawsuit, and it has. And I think that's also something I struggle with. Like at this point, corporate Exide, which I think it's based out of Atlanta technically. Like I think since 2000 has gone through 2 or 3 bankruptcies, and so like they. I think it was like a few years ago when there was a big class action lawsuit. Exide had to, as part of the agreement with the feds, they had to donate like $50 million to cleanup efforts. And like there were some other stipulations, and like, part of the lawsuit, and again, I'm not like a legal scholar, said something along the lines of like, if you break this rule or like these elements, then like we go back into and the agreement goes away. Then the NOA, I'll have to think about it. And then it turned out that, like, based on evidence, we believe that they didn't meet that element of the agreement, but they're also now in bankruptcy again. So it's just like these like kind of long protracted systems. So it is an effective tool, but it's not the perfect tool because even with class action lawsuits, they can just take so long and get dragged through systems, and like you can never like undo some of the externalities, right? Like you might be able to like pay, like there might be financial elements and you could pay someone or you could fix up soil lead, but you can never like undo some of that harm really.
Well, careful there, you can never undo externalities. It's like just by definition, whatever happened in previous years, it's already there. No? So it's, unless they clean up the environmental damage. No?
Mm-hmm. And we just have a few minutes left, so I'm wondering, Christy, maybe we could do a very short kind of lightning round. Because Stephen, you had a great question about looking at workers as well as residents and whether that was kind of part of the your analysis or not. And I was also really keen on I'm looking at trying for the page number here. It looks like it's page 27 when you're talking about gentrification and kind of gave that personal anecdote of what it was like to be yelled at, stop gentrification. I saw that as kind of a appealing, angle in the paper that didn't seem to be kind of fully built out. So I guess I'm wondering what value you think that, experience and perspective kind of adds to this. And if you plan to kind of build that out, a little bit more in the next draft or not, but so feel free to take either both of those as you'd like.
Okay, let me look at the first one real quick. I'm just scrolling at the chat. Stephen, I'll just shoot you an email because when you mentioned the rendering plant in Vernon, and I got some really interesting content about that I didn't include in this manuscript, but I'll just share another version of this with you. I think the point on the workers is really important. They were hard to track down. I met with some workers who work in the surrounding area, and I chatted with someone who had some access to it, but like, they had probably like about 100 staff. And I think that they were hard to track down. I don't think that they were necessarily really bought into the idea of talking with like someone, whether because they might not have like the agency or like, or worried about repercussions in some way. That happened a few times. I've had a couple people say like, my lawyers aren't supposed to tell me I'm not supposed to talk to you, but I will, but like make sure that like you don't have a record of like attaching me to my name. So I think that that's something I need to kind of maybe flesh out more. I definitely agree, Scott, about the gentrification comment. I was actually kind of scrolling through the manuscript. I'm like, my second and third points on like the qualitative side are really succinct, and they could be built out more and maybe truncate elsewhere. It's really tricky, right? Like, and there's not like widespread agreement, because I was even talking with some of like my collaborators who are Latino who live in the community, and they were almost rolling their eyes, like, because I was standing with one of them as we kind of got shouted at, and he was just like, I don't know what. So it's very sticky. Maybe that's part of the reason, like subconsciously, that I didn't get into it as much as I should have. Because even that element of gentefication, where it's a member of like that individual community who is contributing to like economic growth, that was also being kind of like vilified in some way, I thought was really interesting, because at that point it's not like you know, outsiders who are white and coming in and like doing these things. It was like kind of elements within the own community that like pushed against growth. So it's a double-edged sword of like not wanting harm, because no community wants like harm in terms of like hazardous waste and some of these other things that are associated with low income, heavily burdened communities, but then also not wanting growth. So it's like this double, like, so like that's something that I definitely need to flesh out more, and I don't have a great answer on, but that's helpful.
Oh, that's great. And as you could tell, there's lots of other, I think, great directions we could take this, but unfortunately we're out of time. So please do follow up directly with Christy, you know, Stephen and others to continue the conversation. And if you have any closing remarks, Christy, you're more than welcome to make them.
Oh gosh, on the spot. No, I thank you for your time, everyone, today. This has been kind of like my first attempt at kind of truncating a big unwieldy thing into something for this group and for others. So I appreciate some of your comments, because I think a lot of this is going to be things that I go into and revise for the next draft. So I appreciate that a lot. Thank you.
No, we appreciate you. There's a lot of potential here. So another round of applause for Christy. That's fantastic. A lot of great work there to celebrate. And then just as a reminder, guys, we have Frank tomorrow. We have Governing the Commons on Friday. And then next Wednesday for the research series, we're trying something different again. And we're actually inviting the whole polycentricity working group to give some updates about all the different cool projects going on there. So encourage you guys to attend that if you're able to as well. So thanks so much again, Christy. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks for joining. Take care.
Thank you.
Nice job again.